In the eerie silence that followed the fall of the city, the skies seemed to darken, as if nature itself was mourning the end of an era. The ground was soaked with the blood of fallen knights, the air filled with the cries of the wounded, and the stench of death lingered long after the last battle was fought. This was the aftermath of the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, a disastrous campaign that marked the end of the age of chivalry and the beginning of a new, darker chapter in European history. For centuries, the ideals of chivalry had shaped the world of the nobility. Knights were supposed to be the paragon of virtue, embodying courage, honor, and nobility. They were the protectors of the weak, the defenders of the realm, and the champions of the church. But as the 14th century drew to a close, these ideals were increasingly seen as empty rhetoric, a facade that could not hide the rot beneath. The Battle of Nicopolis was supposed to be a grand crusade, a noble endeavor to drive the Ottoman Turks out of Europe and reclaim the Holy Land. It was a moment of great pomp and ceremony, with knights from across Christendom gathering to embark on this holy mission. But the reality of the campaign was far from the romanticized visions of chivalry. Instead, it was a chaotic and poorly organized affair, marked by infighting, lack of discipline, and a complete disregard for the welfare of the common soldiers. When the Crusaders finally faced the Ottoman army, they were soundly defeated. The Turkish forces, led by Sultan Bayezid I, were better organized, better equipped, and far more disciplined. The European knights, despite their bravado, were no match for the professionalism of the Ottoman military. The defeat was catastrophic, and it sent shockwaves throughout Europe. It was a clear sign that the old ways of warfare, the ways of chivalry, were no longer sufficient in the face of a new, more brutal reality. The aftermath of Nicopolis was a time of soul-searching and despair. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart, who had once celebrated the glory of chivalry, now found themselves questioning the very foundations of the system. Where were the great enterprises and valiant men? Where were the glorious battles and conquests? The times were changing, and not for the better. The once glorious age of chivalry was giving way to an era of violence, corruption, and moral decay. In England, the poet Deschamps lamented the loss of the old virtues. He wrote that the times were changed for the worse, and that now felonies and hates were nourished. The knights, he said, had become soft, more interested in fine wines and white shirts than in the hard work of defending the realm. In France, the moralist Jean de Mézières composed an Epistère lamentable et consolatoire, a lament for the fallen knights, and a call for a return to the moral virtues of order, discipline, obedience, and justice. But his words fell on deaf ears. The world was moving on, and the old ways were being left behind. The defeat at Nicopolis was a turning point, but it was not the only sign of the decline of chivalry. Across Europe, the knightly class was facing increasing criticism. The chronicler of the Quatre Valois pointed out that in recent battles, it was often the common soldiers who had been decisive. The peasants, who could endure hardship and coarse food, had shown themselves capable of waging a good fight. In the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385, Portuguese peasants had fought bravely and killed many knights. This was a clear challenge to the fundamental assumption of chivalry, that military capacity resided only in the mounted knight. The knightly class, however, was not ready to share the glory or the responsibility. As long as combat was the source of honor and glory, the knights had no wish to see the commoner rise. This resistance to change only deepened the divide between the nobility and the common people, a divide that would eventually lead to widespread social unrest. The aftermath of Nicopolis also had political consequences. The defeat weakened France's position in Europe and led to a period of internal turmoil. The French king Charles VI was already struggling with mental illness, and the defeat only exacerbated his condition. The royal court was rife with factionalism, and the kingdom was on the brink of civil war. Meanwhile, the English, under King Richard II, were facing their own challenges. Richard's misrule and his increasing reliance on French influence had made him deeply unpopular, and the stage was set for a dramatic political upheaval. In 1399, Richard's cousin, Henry of Bolingbroke, led a rebellion against the king. With widespread support from the nobility and the common people, Henry was able to depose Richard without a single battle. Richard was forced to abdicate and was later imprisoned, where he died under mysterious circumstances. The rise of Henry IV marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the House of Lancaster. But the political instability did not end there. Henry's reign was marked by constant rebellion, and the country remained in a state of turmoil. The fall of Richard II was a shock to the medieval world. For Froissart, it was a moment that shattered his ideals. The deposition of a king, even a weak and unpopular one, was a subversive act that challenged the very order of society. The world that Froissart and his contemporaries knew was crumbling, and the future was uncertain. The 14th century was a time of great upheaval. It was a period marked by the Black Death, which had devastated the population and left a deep sense of fear and uncertainty. It was a time of fierce and tragic conflicts, bizarre fates, and capricious money. It was a time of sorcery, betrayals, insurrections, and the downfall of princes. The knightly class, once the backbone of society, was failing to protect the realm. The church, more worldly than spiritual, was failing to guide the way to God. The towns, once agents of progress and the common good, were absorbed in mutual hostilities and divided by class war. The population, depleted by the Black Death, was struggling to recover. The war between England and France and the brigandage it spawned revealed the emptiness of chivalry's military pretensions and the falsity of its moral claims. Despite the chaos, change was taking place. The failures of the old institutions opened the way for new demands. The oppressed were no longer willing to endure their suffering in silence. They were rebelling, although their efforts were often inadequate and unready. Marcel, the good Parliament, the Jacques, the Popolo Minuto of Florence, and the English peasants all tried to bring about reform, but their efforts were ultimately crushed. Yet the seeds of change had been sown. The 15th century would bring new challenges and new opportunities. The forces set in motion during the 14th century would play themselves out, sometimes in exaggerated form. The Black Death would return, but it would eventually disappear, leaving a society that was physically and morally weakened. The cult of death would grow more extreme, and the struggle to end the schism and reform the church would become more desperate. Depopulation would reach its lowest point, and the world would be left in a state of uncertainty. In France, the assassination of Louis d'Orléans in 1407 by his rival, Jean de Nevers, would plunge the kingdom into a period of civil war. The 100 Years' War would continue, and the English would eventually be driven out of France. But the war would leave a deep scar on the nation, and the process of healing would be long and painful. Yet, amidst the chaos, new energies were beginning to emerge. The centralized monarchy was gaining strength, and the idea of the national state was taking root. Seaborne enterprise, liberated by the compass, was reaching out to the wider world. Literature, from Dante to Chaucer, was expressing itself in national languages, laying the groundwork for the great leap forward in print. In the year that Ingera de Coucy died, Johann Gutenberg was born. Although his invention would not mark an immediate turn of the tide, it would eventually revolutionize the way information was disseminated and pave the way for the Renaissance. The ills and disorders of the 14th century could not be without consequence. Times would grow worse over the next 50-odd years, but at some imperceptible moment, by some mysterious chemistry, energies would be refreshed. Ideas would break out of the mold of the Middle Ages, and humanity would find itself redirected. The world was on the cusp of a new era, and the seeds of change, planted in the chaos of the 14th century, would eventually bear fruit. In the end, the Battle of Nicopolis and the events that followed it were not just a turning point in the history of chivalry. They were a turning point in the history of Europe itself. They marked the end of an old world and the beginning of a new one, a world that would be shaped by new ideas, new technologies, and new social movements. The era of chivalry may have ended in disaster, but the world it left behind was one that was ready for a new beginning.